Hey, sports card fans, it's John Wade Boggs fan. Hope you're all doing well. This past Wednesday, I happened to be on YouTube and I came across the live stream of Sports Card Live with Jeremy Lee. And Jeremy had as his guest Craig of Craig's Cards, and they were discussing a very fascinating and I think important topic within the hobby, which is the future of sports card era classifications. So defining which eras they are and the time frames of sports cards throughout the history of cards. And it was a really, really good discussion. There was a lot of interaction from those that were on the live stream. If you didn't catch it, I will have a link to that recorded live stream in the description of this video. Definitely go check it out. It was a little over an hour discussion, and it was really good. You can tell that Jeremy and Craig put a lot of time and analysis and thought into their definitions of the different eras of sports cards, and within those eras, different periods, shorter time frames within a specific era. Now, I agree with some of the things that there are some of their definitions or time frames, but there's some other things that I have a difference of opinion on. I don't want to say I disagree, because that implies that I think I may be right and they're wrong. That's not the case. Because obviously, even within that live stream, there were a whole different set of opinions and thoughts. And I think Jeremy and Craig realized and said so at one point during the live stream that this is a work in progress. This is their first go at trying to come up with these new definitions for eras and periods within those eras. And so I just wanted to do a video here where I give my take and my thoughts and opinion on what I think the different eras and to some extent the periods within those eras, although I'm not concentrating too much on the periods. I understand why they structured it the way they did, defining, to come up with the eras to look at different periods of time within sports cards to try to come up with multiple periods and then have those periods fit into a larger era. So the thought process, I think, was really good. I just have a difference of opinion and maybe some of the periods and how they came to the time frames and definitions of some of the eras. So I'm going to pull up some slides here and go over some of the things that Jeremy and Craig defined as their eras and give my thoughts in areas where I may have a difference of opinion from the two of them. All right, so they came up with 4 eras, and within those areas, some different periods of time. So their first era was vintage pre-war, and they defined that era going from 1888 to 1941. And within that era, they came up with 3 periods. They had the tobacco period, which was 1888 to 1912. Then they had the candy period from 1923 to 1932. And then the gum period from 1933 to 1941. Again, I didn't really put any thoughts as to my thoughts toward the different periods within vintage pre-war. Generally speaking, I agree with their definition of the vintage pre-war era. Their next era is vintage post-war. Now, they defined the era of vintage post-war going from 1948 to 1989. And they pretty much had one period that encompassed all of vintage post-war, and that was another gum period from 1948 to 1989. And again, I don't want to steal all their thunder and all the comments that they made. I think it's good for you to maybe check out that video to go over and listen to some of their thought processes on how they came up with these different periods and eras. So their third era was the modern era. and they define that as being from 1990 to 2019. And they had 4 different periods that they talked about that made up their modern era. And that was the junk wax period and they defined it from 1990 to 1993, the dead period from 1994 to 1996, the creative or experimental period from 1997 to 1999, and then the insert period. Now, I think Jeremy and Craig said that the insert meant inserts, parallels, memorabilia, the autographs and all those things go with it. I think they threw everything into the insert period, and I think they even said that maybe the term insert may not be like the correct terminology to use, but they defined it as being from 2000 to 2019. And then they defined the 4th era as the ultra modern era, and that would be from 2020 to the present day. And one of the time periods within that ultra modern, which again makes up the whole ultra modern period, is 10x the hobby and everything that goes with it. And they used one of the cutoffs that they used for ultra modern was COVID. They recognized, and I think rightly so, that there was a big break and pause within sports cards with World War II. And I think it's generally recognized and accepted that there is a specific division between vintage pre-war and vintage post-war. Now, some of you in the comments pointed out that they had a gap there between 1941 and 1948, and that there were some exhibit cards that were released between 1941 and 1948. So again, I think they may we're looking to maybe expand maybe vintage pre-war to 1948, or maybe include a couple more years with the vintage post-war. But again, they were taking all the comments, and generally speaking, they agreed and saw maybe some needs to tweak some of these things. So with that said, here's some of the things that I agree with what was discussed, and then I go into some of the things that I have a difference of opinion on. All right, so a couple of things that I agree with that were brought up, and some of these were brought up by some of those who were commenting on the live stream, is to drop the word vintage from the pre-war era. I think it goes without saying that cards from before World War II are vintage, so I think it's just a little redundant to have the word vintage in pre-war, so I'm fine calling it just the pre-war era. And I think someone else suggested to drop post-war from the vintage era. Again, it's sort of understood that if you have pre-war, then there's sort of post-war, and that goes into the whole concept of, okay, where does vintage end and modern start? So I think that's a great idea to start off there and to just have a pre-war era and then followed by a vintage era. So here are some of the areas that I have just a different viewpoint from what Jeremy and Craig came up with. So the first one is I have a difference of opinion of when their vintage post-war era ends. So again, going back to their chart there, they have the vintage post-war era ending in 1989. So again, for now, I'm not going to go specifically into the reasons being. I think it'll become apparent as I go through my other thoughts here. But I just have a different viewpoint in extending the vintage post-war era all the way up to 1989. And then, of course, the start and end of their modern era. And also, it's a small little point, but when their junk wax period started, I think they started it in 1990. I know in 1987, it was still hard for me to find 87 Fleer and Donruss outside my local card shop, But once 1988 hit, they were all over the place. You could trip over 88 Donners and Flair and tops. So for me, junk wax starts in 1988. We sort of agree on the ending time period of junk wax, 1993, maybe 1994. You can make an argument of when exactly the junk wax period ended. I think for this discussion, it's not really that important, but I just wanted to note that I had just a different viewpoint of their time frame for the junk wax period. All right, the other thing I have different thoughts on is that COVID had an impact on cards. Again, that was their main point or defining moment between modern and ultra modern. I agree that COVID definitely had an impact on the hobby, definitely. But I don't think COVID per se, or the time since COVID, really had an impact on the cards themselves. And again, I'll get more into that a little bit later here. And the other thought process that they had with the ultra modern era is that should be sort of a running time frame. Like no matter where you are, whether it's going into 2025 or if we're at 2030, that ultra modern would comprise of the previous, say, maybe 3, maybe up to 5 years. So that would be a running time frame. And then their modern era, I suppose, would then just extend the time frame to where ultra modern would begin. I think that's maybe the wrong way to look at it. And again, you'll see as I go through here and how I define my terms on how that may not make sense. At least it doesn't make sense to me. All right. So the next thing here that I have a different viewpoint on is through their discussion and through a lot of those that were making comments on the live stream. I think when they started getting into discussing the different periods, and I think maybe half the live stream was devoted to discussing different periods within mainly the modern era. And where I think they lost focus or maybe got off on a tangent was they brought up and discussed, and some of these came from not just Jeremy and Craig, but from the others that chimed in on the live stream, is that they started talking about hobby periods, which I feel are different than card periods. And to me, this whole discussion of sports card era classifications should be devoted to cards themselves and not the hobby. So some of the things that were brought up, the Beckett price guide period, eBay, whatnot, the junk slab period, breakers, flipping investing, Jeff Wilson was brought up, hobby influencers, the crack and reslab period, the grading period, the 10x the hobby period, CT scanning, the boomer period, and repacks, among other things that were brought up. And these proposed periods, to me, just reflect how people within the hobby buy and sell their cards, how they protect their cards, how they view cards, how they buy cards. So you got the repacks, the crack and reslab, the junk slab era. It all has to do with how we buy, sell, and collect cards. It has nothing to do with the actual cards themselves. So I think the discussion needs to be brought back to the cards themselves and not about the greater hobby period or hobby in itself. All right, so my take on their discussion, which again, I don't want to put anything negative about them. This isn't meant to be, hey, this is what I think and I'm right and they're wrong. They had some excellent thoughts and put a lot of time and effort into this. And I think, if anything, started the discussion. And even they said, it's just two of them and their thoughts. I'm just one person, and these are my thoughts and ideas and so on. So my take on this is the eras and periods, if we're talking about sports card era classifications, they should be based on the cards, not the hobby. Actually, what would be a very interesting study would be what eras and periods are for the hobby as a whole. When did the sports card hobby start? Maybe it was the standard classification of all the cards. I think it was done maybe in the 40s or 50s. Were people, in some sense, people were collecting cards prior to then, maybe putting them in photo albums or in boxes, and they kept them. Maybe that was the very, very early stages of the hobby, and then you get into all the different advancements and different time periods of the hobby itself. That, I think, would be a great sort of side analysis and discussion. So maybe someone would be willing and interested in doing that. So that was the first take that I have from this. The second one is, I thought through this process, and I feel that there are currently 4 eras for sports cards, although my time frames and titles or definitions of those 4 areas are slightly different than what Jeremy and Craig put together. So I think the difficulty that all of us are trying to wrap our arms around with these different era classifications is some of the definitions or the mindset of those of us in the hobby. So if you ask someone, okay, what's vintage? Chances are people are going to say, well, vintage means old. And then you say, okay, well, what does modern mean? Well, I think a lot of us would say, well, modern means new. Okay. So I think the struggle is that, we use the words, vintage and modern all the time. And I think all of us are looking for that specific time, that place in time where cards are no longer old and they become new. And that's where the struggle is. Well, at what point does a card become old, and when is it considered new? And so to me, I think there needs to be something in between. There needs to be a bridge that you can move from the vintage and old cards to the modern and new cards. So I think that there should be another era between vintage and modern. Now, of course, all of this is an issue of perspective based on the age of us involved in the hobby. I'm 52 years old, not too far away from 53. So my mindset of what cards are old and new is going to be vastly different from someone who's 18 years old and in the hobby, and what cards they consider old versus new. So again, I don't think, and I think I know Jeremy and Craig said this, I don't think their discussion on that live stream is going to, set things in stone. Certainly my comments here are not going to be where what everyone comes together and agrees upon. Because you have, various ages within the hobby. You have, teenagers all the way up to, 70, 80-year-olds that are in the hobby. And they have different perspectives on how they see old and new cards. All right. So what I decided to do is I put together a time frame or timeline of certain things that happened, or I call it recent advancements in sports cards. Now, these aren't necessarily my definitions of periods within a certain era, but these are just some things that I thought about that were advancements within sports cards over the last pretty much 40 years. Okay. So the first one is in 1981 was the end of Topps monopoly in sports cards. And to me, I think that was a crucial and critical point within cards. Now, you may argue that it's a hobby related occurrence and instance and impact, and you could make an argument, and I could see the argument there. But the way I'm thinking of it is in 1981, right, for up to 30 years prior to, it was Topps and only Topps, right, for the most part, as major card manufacturers. Then in 1981, competition opened up. So that led to innovation, different thought processes on cards, design, materials. All that stuff started in 1981, right? And that impact of what took place in 1981 of allowing more card companies to produce cards really still goes through today. Now, you may say, okay, today there's more of a consolidation with Topps/Fanatics, but there's still Panini and Leaf, and you may say, well, they're non-licensed. But so maybe there's a end to that impact of the Topps monopoly. Maybe that ends in 2024, 2025, we'll see. But for now, I kept it, 1981 through today. The impact of Topps losing their monopoly still has an impact on cards. Next are inserts. Now, from my research, I may be off here, but I remember in 1987 in Leaf product, or Flair product, I should say, in 1987 Leaf, there was a Headliners insert. I know because Wade Boggs was in that Headliners card, and that was a specific insert in packs, and it was a separate subset of cards. And so I consider that the first insert, although to be fair, you may say, hey John, back in, I think it was 1964, Topps inserted those Topps tattoos. I don't know if they were every pack or not, but technically you could maybe go back and make a case that even before 1987 there were some technical inserts, but I think from a more modern standpoint, I think inserts started in 1987. I'm going to say with Flair, and inserts continue to this day. The next is junk wax. Now, again, I mentioned that I have that time frame from 1988 to 1994. Really, that junk wax time frame or timeline really doesn't have an impact through today, but I listed it on my timeline. The next is Upper Deck, coming on board in 1989, dramatically changed card design, production, materials used, and that impact has gone through to the present day. What Upper Deck did in 1989 sent sort of ripples throughout card manufacturers in terms of the designing of the card, the look of the card, the print quality. All that stuff changed in 1989, and the effects are still felt today. Next are pack inserted autos. This first took place in 1990 Upper Deck with the Reggie Jackson insert autograph cards, and there are still pack inserted autos today. Next are serial number cards, 1991 to present. I think 1991, the Donruss Elite Series, I think, were the first cards to be serial numbered. I think they were out of like 50,000 or 10,000 or something like that. And there are still serial numbered cards today. Then you go to 1992, where Topps ended the use of their standard cardboard stock. So 1992, they switched the material used for cards. Now, you could say, hey John, 1989 Upper Deck didn't use standard cardboard, and you can even make a case of going back to 1981, where Donruss and Flair didn't use the standard cardboard stock that Topps used. But because Topps has been around so long, and they were sort of always considered the flag bearer, the standard bearer for cards, even with young companies like Upper Deck coming on board, the fact that that Topps ended their use of that standard cardboard and moved to a more modern cardstock. All that stuff continues to present day. Then you have the first parallel cards. 1992, I think, for the Topps, the gold foil parallels. I think those may have been the first. Again, let me know in the comments if I may have some of these dates wrong. I very well could be, but you get the general sense of, hopefully, of what I'm going over here. So 1992 to present, the first parallel cards. And again, if anything, the card companies are just flooding their sets with parallel cards. Next, finest refractors came on board. Topps finest refractors in 1993. That started the whole technology of the card design, and different ways. So you got, you have refractors and everything that goes about it. You have the Dufex, all that technology used for sports cards started in 1993. Then you get to, we had serial number cards come on board in 1991. I believe the first one-of-one numbered cards were in 1997. I think it may have been the Flair set, and their Showcase series were one-of-one cards back in 1997. And again, that continues today. And then you have memorabilia cards. I think in 1997, Upper Deck had the first game-used jersey cards, and that has exploded today to, hat pieces, cleat pieces, actual spikes on from a player's cleat are now in cards like, a half an inch thick with an actual cleat from the player's shoe. So that continues today and continues to expand. Then you have, like I said, the memorabilia cards in 1997. And then finally, high-end products came on board around 2001. I started that in 2001 with Topps Tribute. And you can maybe make a case that maybe a little bit earlier or maybe a little bit later than 2001 was really the start of card companies coming up with more high-end, more expensive products. Of course, that's growing today as well. So with this timeline in mind, that goes from really 1981 to say 2001 or the early 2000s, I started to try to think of this gap or this bridge between vintage and modern cards. And so I started to think of some terms that could reflect this bridge era. And so I came upon the word classic. And so I looked up some of the definitions of the word classic, and here are some of the definitions. Judged over a period of time to be of the highest quality and outstanding of its kind. Or high quality, used to mean something that is valued because it has a traditional style. Another definition is something of lasting worth. Another definition is of the first or highest quality, class, or rank. But the last definition here really sort of sold it for me, is to meet common high standards for quality, appeal, longevity, and influence. All right. So that last definition there, if we go back to my timeline here, a lot of these things that happened between 1981, especially into, let's say, the late 80s, early into maybe the late 90s, all those advancements in sports cards had a longevity, had an influence on cards, added to the quality and high standards of cards that hadn't been present prior to 1981. And a time frame, a standard time frame for a classic period is maybe 10 to 50 years old. So with that, here are the four eras. I didn't go into periods, but the four areas that I came up with and the time frames. So here they are. So my sports card eras would be: one, the pre-war era, again dropping the vintage. Now, I have that as 1887 to 1947. Now, there may be some sports cards that were made prior to 1887. I was thinking Allen and Ginter, but let's just assume started in 1887 to 1947. That's roughly a 60-year time frame for that era. My next era would be vintage. Now that would go from 1948 to 1980, right before Topps lost their monopoly on sports cards. And so that era lasted 32 years. Then I get to my classic era. This is where all the explosion of cards took place from my timeline there. And that would be from 1981 to 2010, roughly a 30-year period. Then I have modern from 2011 to present, which currently, once we get into 2025, would be 15 years. Now, I know you may be saying, John, you want to focus on the card and not the hobby. Why did you choose 2010? What was so special about 2010 to 2011 with cards that took place? And to be honest with you, nothing. I thought, obviously, let's go back to my timeline here. So you have all these things that took place that had its infancy, let's say in the 90s, and even the high-end products in the early 2000s. That was the early start for a lot of these things. So I took the classic period into and up to 2010 as sort of the buildup of all these different advancements in sports cards. Now, obviously, you can disagree, and I'm open for discussion. Is it maybe 1981 to 2000, maybe a 20-year period, maybe make it 2005? Well, my thought process is that the start or the end of the monopoly for Topps, and then the start of all these advancements in sports cards and the time frame to really have them take hold and expand. I extended the time frame for my classic era to 2010. And then modern would go from 2011 to present. Now, ultra modern, I know that's a phrase and terminology that is very common now in the hobby. It's ultra modern, ultra modern. To me, again, COVID, while being an important part and an inflection point in history, like World War II, nothing changed with cards. The hobby certainly changed when COVID hit and post-COVID. But cards themselves, the cards that were produced in 2018 and 2019 were pretty much the same as the cards produced in 2020 and 21 and 22. You have your patch autos, your insert cards, all the parallels, all that stuff were present prior to COVID and have continued since COVID. So for me, I have 4 eras, but reserved ultra modern for some time in the future. Maybe when modern gets to be 20, 25 years old. Who knows? Maybe at some point, the card companies are going to produce cards where you push a button and a little hologram comes up and it has the player there hitting the ball or doing some. Who knows what technology is going to come about in years from now relating to sports cards and the production, the design, how sports cards are going to look, how they're going to be sold, maybe. But again, that may get more into the hobby aspect of how they're being sold. So for me, I have 4 eras, with ultra modern not being a technical era yet, but reserved for some time in the future where modern sort of runs its course. So there you go. My take on the excellent discussion that Jeremy and Craig had on the latest Sports Card Live from last Wednesday. Would love to know in the comments what your thoughts and opinions are to both what Jeremy and Craig presented and my thoughts that I presented here, and try to be kind and gentle in your comments. I'm not trying to offend anyone here. These are just my thoughts here, but would love to know your thoughts, because we all have opinions. This is just my opinion, and I value your opinion just like I value Jeremy's and Craig's opinion. So with that, that's all I have for you. So until next time, thanks for watching.